The woman accidentally discovered a large hole at her husband's grave, and in a panic, she used a shovel to dig it up. When she saw what was buried underground, she immediately called the police. Arabella tightened the scarf around her neck as she knelt beside her late husband's gravestone. The chill in the air seemed sharper today, or perhaps it was her imagination. The small trowel in her hand brushed aside damp leaves as she worked to clear the base of the stone. Her hands were steady, practiced, as if tending to this small patch of earth could somehow keep her husband's memory alive. "I'm back, Thomas," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "The garden's holding up well. I managed to keep the roses blooming just like you liked them." Her words lingered in the air, unhurried and deliberate, carrying the weight of someone used to talking to silence. This had become her ritual. Every Tuesday, rain or shine, Arabella visited him. It wasn't just about the flowers or the clean gravestone. It was about keeping the connection alive. But this morning, something was different. Something wasn't right. It wasn't the usual stillness of the cemetery that made her pause. It was the small, shallow hole a few feet from the gravestone. The earth there looked fresh, darker, and looser than the surrounding ground. Arabella straightened, her fingers clutching the trowel tighter. She tilted her head, studying it. "What on earth?" she whispered. The hole wasn't big, no larger than a dinner plate, but it was out of place, jarring against the otherwise undisturbed landscape. At first, Arabella thought of animals. Maybe a stray dog had wandered in and decided to dig here. That seemed logical enough, didn't it? But something about it didn't sit right. She stepped closer, nudging aside a few scattered leaves with the toe of her shoe. The edges of the hole were neat, almost deliberate, as though someone had taken care not to make a mess. Her stomach tightened at the thought. "Don't be ridiculous, Arabella," she muttered to herself. "It's just a dog, or maybe even a squirrel. There's no reason to let your imagination run wild." Still, she couldn't shake the unease prickling at the back of her neck. She crouched down for a better look, but she didn't dare dig any further. This wasn't the time for that. Not yet. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the empty rows of headstones. There was no sign of anyone nearby. Arabella exhaled and stood. The feeling lingered, heavy and persistent, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. She gathered her tools and started back toward the car, glancing over her shoulder one last time. The hole waited, as quiet and ominous as before. That evening, Arabella couldn't get it out of her mind. She sat in her small kitchen, staring at the cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The steady ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, but her thoughts were louder. What if it wasn't an animal? The thought crept in, unwelcome, but insistent. What if someone had been digging near Thomas's grave? But why? She set the cup down, pressing her hands flat against the table. The logical part of her brain insisted it was nothing, just a harmless fluke. But her gut told a different story. There was something deliberate about that hole, something that didn't belong. Arabella thought back to the time she had walked the cemetery grounds. She had come to know this place well, the soft curves of the paths, the way the trees cast shadows on sunny afternoons. Nothing here had ever felt out of place before. Tonight, though, the memory of the hole loomed large in her mind, growing darker with each passing hour. She caught herself glancing out the window more than once, as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. Her logical mind fought to dismiss the unease, but it was no use. By the time she went to bed, the decision was made. She would go back. She would bring a proper tool, a small shovel maybe, and she would dig just a little, enough to ease her mind. If it was nothing, then fine. But if there was something buried there, she needed to know. Arabella couldn't shake the weight of her decision as she walked toward her car Wednesday morning. It wasn't just another routine visit to Thomas's grave. This was different. She had spent the entire night replaying the image of that hole in her mind, questioning whether she had imagined its deliberate placement. But she knew better. The details were too vivid, too deliberate. The thought of it gnawed at her, kept her tossing and turning. She could feel the unease in the pit of her stomach, the way it tightened every time her thoughts circled back to the graveyard. Today wasn't about ritual or solace. Today was about answers. Her footsteps felt heavier as she reached the graveyard, each crunch of gravel underfoot amplifying the steady thud of her heart. Her bag hung over one shoulder, the small garden shovel inside bumping gently against her hip. The morning chill wrapped around her, but her focus didn't waver. As Arabella approached the grave, her breath caught. The hole was still there, but something was different. The edges looked neater now, and a layer of dry leaves covered it more thoroughly than before. Someone had tried to conceal it. She stopped, frozen in place, her eyes darting to the rows of gravestones around her. No one was there. The cemetery was still and silent, the only movement the gentle sway of tree branches in the breeze. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't her imagination. Someone else had been here. Arabella knelt by the grave, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed away the leaves, revealing the dark soil underneath. The dirt looked fresher than before, as though it had been disturbed again. Her thoughts raced. Was it an animal, as she'd tried to convince herself yesterday? Or was someone actually tampering with the gravesite? Arabella reached into her bag and pulled out the small shovel. She hesitated, staring down at the dirt, her chest tightening. A part of her felt like she was crossing a line, disturbing a space that wasn't hers to touch. But another part of her, the part that refused to let this go, pushed her forward. She pressed the shovel into the soil, the sound of metal slicing through dirt louder than she'd expected. The ground gave way easily, the soil soft and loose, almost as if it had been dug up and replaced. The deeper she dug, the more certain she became that this wasn't natural. The soil wasn't packed tightly, and the deeper layers still held the faint scent of fresh earth. This had been done recently. After a few minutes, the shovel hit something solid. Arabella froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was sharp and hollow, a metallic clink that sent a shiver through her. Her heart pounded as she set the shovel aside and reached into the hole with her gloved hands. Her fingers brushed against something cool and smooth. It took her a moment to get a firm grip, but eventually she pulled it free. It was a box. The small metal container sat heavily in her hands, its surface scratched and dented. A tiny padlock secured the lid, its edges rusted but unyielding. Arabella stared at the box for a long moment, her breath uneven. The padlock glinted faintly in the dim light filtering through the branches above her. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should stop, turn around, and take it directly to the authorities. And yet, her hands betrayed her. They wouldn't stop tracing the edges of the box, wouldn't release their grip. Her knuckles turned white as she clutched it tighter. Why here? Why now? Why Thomas's grave? The questions swirled in her head louder with every passing second. Her heart ached at the thought of someone desecrating the one place she trusted to remain untouched. "This doesn't belong here," she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and unease. Her gaze dropped to the small shovel still lying on the disturbed earth. It wasn't a locksmith's tool, but it would do. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Arabella crouched down, holding the box steady on the ground. She wedged the flat edge of the shovel beneath the padlock, pressing down firmly. The metal groaned, but it didn't give. "Come on," she hissed through clenched teeth. She pressed harder, her frustration mounting as the lock stubbornly refused to yield. The sound of distant leaves rustling made her freeze. She snapped her head up, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes scanned the empty rows of gravestones, the skeletal trees lining the edges of the cemetery, but there was nothing. Just the faint wind stirring the branches. She shook her head, willing herself to focus. "Get it together, Arabella," she whispered. She pressed the shovel against the padlock again, this time with a sharp, deliberate force. A sudden snap rang out, loud and jarring in the cemetery's stillness. The lock clattered to the ground, and Arabella stared at it, her hands trembling. The lid of the box creaked as she pried it open. Her stomach churned with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Inside, several small plastic bags were packed neatly together, their contents pale and powdery. For a moment, Arabella could only blink, confusion clouding her thoughts. At first, she wondered if it might be flour or maybe sugar. But as her eyes lingered, her gut told her otherwise. The bags were too pristine, too deliberately sealed. This wasn't food, and it wasn't innocent. Her breath quickened. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Could this be drugs? Something illegal? If so, who would bury it here, of all places? The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on her chest. Arabella reached out, hesitating for just a moment before touching one of the bags. It was cold to the touch, smooth beneath her fingertips. The unease she'd felt earlier began to deepen, spreading through her like a creeping shadow. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, thin and distant. For a brief moment, she considered putting the box back where she'd found it, burying it as if she'd never seen it. But the thought was fleeting. She couldn't leave it here, not when it was so close to Thomas's grave, tainting the ground that should have been sacred. Her gaze shifted toward the path leading back to her car. What if someone saw me here? What if they came back? The thought made her pulse race. She looked around again, scanning for any sign of movement, any figure that didn't belong. The cemetery seemed as still as ever, but the silence now felt heavy, oppressive. Arabella snapped the lid of the box shut, her hands fumbling as she secured it as best she could without the lock. She tucked the box under her arm, its weight awkward but manageable. Her feet moved quickly, her boots crunching against the gravel as she made her way toward the car. Her mind churned with questions. Who could have put it there? How long had it been buried? And more importantly, why here, so close to Thomas? The implications twisted her stomach into knots. Dada. Car was in sight. Its familiar shape a welcome relief against the backdrop of tombstones. Arabella quickened her pace, the box pressing uncomfortably against her ribs. As she reached the driver's side door, she fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking more than she expected. Sliding into the seat, she locked the doors instinctively, her breathing ragged. The box sat on the passenger seat, an unwelcome companion she couldn't ignore. Her phone sat in the cup holder, but she didn't reach for it immediately. She stared at the box, her thoughts racing faster than she could organize them. Calling the police felt like the right thing to do, the safest thing. But the idea of explaining how she'd come across it made her hesitate. Would they believe her? Or would they think she had something to do with it? Arabella's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles stark white against the fading warmth of the morning light. The small metal box sat on the passenger seat, silent but heavy, an unwelcome guest she couldn't ignore. Her phone lay in the cup holder, its dark screen reflecting her anxious face. She needed to call the police, but something in her gut still held her back. She glanced out the window at the rows of gravestones standing solemn and still, her eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing moved except for the breeze rustling through the trees. Arabella exhaled a shaky breath, trying to convince herself she was alone. But the uneasy feeling clung to her, as persistent as the metallic tang of fear on her tongue. Her hand hovered over the phone, just as she started to pick it up. Movement at the far edge of the cemetery caught her eye. 2 figures emerged from the tree line. They weren't walking aimlessly, like mourners lost in thought. They were purposeful, their heads turning back and forth as if scanning the area. Arabella stiffened. Something about them felt wrong. The 2 men were young, perhaps mid-20s, dressed in hooded sweatshirts and jeans that hung low on their hips. Their movements were sharp, calculated, the kind that made your instincts flare before your mind could catch up. One of them gestured toward the graves, and they began moving in her direction. Arabella's breath caught. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribcage as she sank lower in her seat. "Stay calm. Stay calm," she told herself. Maybe they weren't here for her. Maybe they were just passing through, heading toward some other part of the cemetery. But as they drew closer, their path became clear. They were heading for the exact spot where she'd been digging. Panic clawed at her throat. Her mind screamed at her to move, to start the car, to do something. But her body felt frozen. She watched as one of them knelt by the disturbed earth, his hand brushing aside the leaves she'd hastily replaced. The other stood watch, his gaze scanning the cemetery, and then, too quickly, locking onto her car. Arabella didn't wait to see what would happen next. Her fingers fumbled for the keys as adrenaline surged through her veins. The engine roared to life, and she shifted into gear, her foot pressing hard on the accelerator. The car lurched forward just as the men began running toward her. Her tires kicked up gravel as she veered onto the narrow cemetery road, the box sliding precariously across the passenger seat. In the rearview mirror, she could see the men chasing after her, their figures shrinking with every second. Relief threatened to wash over her, but it was too soon. She couldn't stop. Not yet. The cemetery exit loomed ahead, the wrought iron gates standing like silent sentinels. Arabella tightened her grip on the wheel, willing herself not to look back. But as she approached the gates, a sharp crack echoed against the car's rear bumper. Her foot slammed on the brake, instinct taking over before logic could intervene. One of the men had hurled a rock, and the sound of impact still rang in her ears. Her heart hammered as she pressed the gas again, pushing the car harder. The gates passed in a blur, and the road beyond stretched out like a lifeline. She glanced at the box, its lid still firmly shut, and felt a fresh wave of determination. Whatever was inside, it was enough to make those men desperate enough to chase her down in broad daylight. But she couldn't let herself think about that now. She had to get away, had to find somewhere safe. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. This time, there was no hesitation. She dialed 911 with one hand, while the other kept the car steady on the road. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in Arabella's mind. I need help, she stammered, her voice shaky but firm. "There are 2 men chasing me. I think they want something I found. I'm driving now, but I don't know if they're still behind me." "Ma'am, can you tell me your location?" the operator asked. Arabella glanced at the passing street signs, her mind racing to make sense of them. "I just left Forest Hills Cemetery. I'm heading east on Maple Avenue, I think." "Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are being dispatched to your location." "Are you in immediate danger?" Arabella hesitated, glancing at the mirror. The road behind her was empty now, the figures of the men nowhere to be seen. But the fear hadn't left her. It clung to her like a shadow. I don't know," she admitted. "I think I lost them, but I can't be sure." The operator stayed with her as she drove, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of Arabella's thoughts. She didn't stop until she reached the police station, its squat brick building a sight more welcoming than she'd ever imagined it could be. Arabella parked haphazardly near the entrance, throwing the car into park before grabbing the box. Its weight felt heavier now, as though it carried not just its contents, but the weight of everything she'd endured. She hurried inside, the sound of the door closing behind her muffled by the pounding of her heart. A uniformed officer approached her almost immediately, his expression shifting from routine indifference to concern as he took in her disheveled appearance and the box clutched tightly to her chest. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. Arabella opened her mouth to answer, but the words caught in her throat. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "I think I found something," she said finally. "And I think it's dangerous." The officer's eyes flicked to the box. "Let's get you somewhere safe, and you can tell me everything." Arabella sat in the small, windowless room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The faint hum of fluorescent lights above her did little to calm the nerves that still danced in her chest. The officer who had taken her statement earlier re-entered the room, the metal box now in his hands. He set it carefully on the table between them, his face unreadable. "We've called in a detective to take a closer look," he said, his voice calm but clipped. "I need you to walk us through everything again. Every detail." Arabella nodded, her throat dry. She glanced at the box, its scratched surface looking out of place in the sterile room. The lock was gone now, and its secrets were only moments away from being revealed. Still, she wasn't sure if she wanted to see what was inside again. She took a breath, her voice barely steady as she started. "I go to my husband's grave every Tuesday," she began. It's something I've done since he passed. Yesterday, I noticed a hole near his grave. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but it didn't look natural. It was too neat." The officer nodded, jotting down notes on a yellow notepad. He gestured for her to continue. "I came back today with a small shovel," Arabella said, her voice trembling slightly as the memories replayed in her mind. "I didn't think I'd find anything, but the soil was fresh. Too fresh. I dug a little, and then—" She motioned toward the box. That was buried there. The officer glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "You did the right thing bringing it in, ma'am," he said. "We're going to figure out what this is all about." Then moments later, a second officer entered, accompanied by a man in plain clothes who introduced himself as Detective Harlan. His handshake was firm, his voice steady and measured. He gave Arabella a reassuring nod before turning his attention to the box. "Let's see what we've got," Harlan said, slipping on a pair of latex gloves. He flipped open the lid with practiced ease, revealing the neatly packed bags of white powder inside. For a moment the room was silent, except for the detective's low whistle. "Well, that's not flour," Harlan muttered, lifting one of the bags carefully. He held it up to the light, inspecting it through the clear plastic. "Looks like cocaine, but we'll have to test it to be sure. Could be something even nastier." Arabella's stomach turned. Hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. How could this end up near my husband's grave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The detective glanced at her, his expression grim. "Unfortunately, cemeteries make for good hiding spots," he explained. "They're quiet, isolated, and no one thinks to look there. Drug runners have been known to use them for years. They'll bury stashes or weapons, anything they don't want found on them if they get stopped." His words hit Arabella like a punch to the gut. The idea that such a vile thing could be hidden so close to where her husband rested made her skin crawl. "That's disgusting," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "That place is supposed to be sacred. How could anyone do that?" Harlan's face softened, but his tone remained firm. "I get it, ma'am. Believe me, I do. But these people don't care about sacred. They care about staying out of prison." Over the next hour, the officers continued to ask Arabella about what she'd seen. The two men, their appearance, the direction they'd come from. She answered as best as she could, though the details felt blurred now, like they belonged to someone else's story. "They were young," she said, gripping the edge of the table. "Maybe mid-20s. One of them had dark hair, the other, I think he was blonde, but I can't be sure. They were wearing hooded sweatshirts, both of them." Harlan nodded, scribbling notes on a pad. "Anything else? Tattoos, scars, the way they walked?" Arabella shook her head. "I didn't get a good look. I was too busy running." "That's understandable," the detective said gently. "What matters is you got away. We'll have our team follow up on this and see what we can find." As the officers prepared to send the evidence to the lab, Harlan turned back to Arabella. "We'll check nearby surveillance, if there is any, and have patrols monitor the area. In the meantime, we'll make sure you're safe. If these men come looking for that box, you let us know immediately." Arabella swallowed hard, her mind racing at the thought. "Do you think they'd come after me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't say for sure," Harlan admitted. "But people who deal with this kind of thing don't like loose ends. We'll have an officer keep an eye on your neighborhood for the next few days just in case." Arabella barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the window made her heart skip a beat. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the two men she'd seen at the cemetery. What if they knew where she lived? What if they came back for the box? Even though she had handed it over to the police, the sense of danger lingered, sharp and unrelenting. By morning, the first light creeping through her curtains felt more like a reprieve than a comfort. Arabella sat up, her body stiff and tired, and resolved to do her part. She couldn't let fear paralyze her. Not now. At the station later that day, Detective Harlan met her with a grim expression that hinted at the weight of the investigation. "Ms. Green," he said, motioning her toward a small conference room. "We've been piecing things together based on what you told us. Your help has already made a difference." Arabella followed him, her stomach twisting. Inside the room, a map of the cemetery and surrounding areas covered one wall, dotted with pins and markings she couldn't decipher. A table in the center held photos and files, each one more ominous than the last. "We've identified some possible suspects," Harlan continued, flipping open a file. He showed her a grainy surveillance photo of two men. "Do these look like the ones you saw?" Arabella leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she studied the image. The quality wasn't great, but the figures were unmistakable. The dark-haired man and his blonde accomplice. She nodded slowly. "That's them," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Harlan gave a curt nod, as though he'd expected her answer. "We've been tracking their movements. It seems they're connected to a larger operation we've been monitoring for months." Over the next hour, Arabella answered more questions, recounting every detail she could remember. The officers listened intently, their expressions shifting between concern and determination. When she finished, Harlan leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "You've been incredibly brave, Miss Green," he said. "But I won't lie to you. This isn't over. These men are small players in a bigger game, and they're dangerous. You've helped us take a big step forward, but it means you might still be at risk." Arabella's throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod. "I understand," she said, though the words felt heavy. "We're assigning someone to keep an eye on you for the next few days," Harlan added. "And if you see anything at all, you call us immediately. No hesitation." As the investigation unfolded, Arabella found herself swept into a world she barely understood. The police worked tirelessly, combing through leads and connecting the dots between the cemetery discovery and other crimes in the area. Detective Harlan called her the next evening with an update. "We've located a few more stash sites," he said. "Same setup, buried in places no one would think to look. The men you saw are part of a larger distribution network. It's well organized, but this box you found might be the break we needed." Arabella listened in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She'd stumbled into something far bigger than she could have imagined, and the thought both terrified and emboldened her. A few days later, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't an update. It was a request. "Ms. Green," Harlan began, his tone serious, "we've apprehended 2 suspects matching your description, but we need you to confirm their identities. Are you willing to come down to the station?" Arabella's chest tightened, but she didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'll do it." At the station, she was led to a small observation room with a one-way mirror. On the other side, 2 men sat at a table, their hands cuffed in front of them. Arabella's breath caught as she recognized them immediately. The dark-haired man with the sharp features, the blonde one with the hood still pulled low over his face. "That's them," she said quietly. Harlan gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll take it from here," he said. The arrests marked a turning point in the investigation. With the suspects in custody, the police uncovered a trove of information, locations of hidden stashes, names of other operatives, and details about their distribution network. It was a breakthrough, but it also confirmed how dangerous the operation truly was. For Arabella, the news brought a mix of relief and unease. She was glad the men were off the streets, but the knowledge of how close she'd come to such danger stayed with her. A shadow she couldn't quite shake. Arabella sat at her kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. A stack of newspapers lay to her right, the headlines bold and unrelenting. "Major drug ring dismantled in local cemetery investigation." Each story painted her as a courageous widow who'd stumbled upon a breakthrough in an otherwise stalled case. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. On one hand, the danger was over. Detective Harlan had assured her of that when he called the night before. The two young men had confessed, providing detailed accounts of the stash locations, the scope of the operation, and the people pulling the strings. Their cooperation had led to multiple arrests and the seizure of a fortune's worth of drugs. "You've done more than you realize, Ms. Green," Harlan had said over the phone. "This case would have taken months, maybe years, to break open without your help." Arabella had thanked him quietly, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Now, staring at the newspaper, she wondered if she should feel proud or simply relieved to have survived. Later that day, her phone rang again. This time, it was a formal invitation. "Arabella Green," the woman on the other end began, her tone brisk but warm. "This is Deputy Chief Morgan. I'm calling to personally invite you to an awards ceremony next week. We'd like to honor your bravery and recognize your significant contribution to this case." Arabella blinked, unsure how to respond. "An awards ceremony?" "Yes, ma'am," Morgan confirmed. "We'll be presenting you with a civilian commendation. It's the least we can do to thank you for your courage." The words sat heavy in Arabella's chest. She didn't feel like a hero, far from it. Every decision she'd made over the past few weeks had been fueled by instinct, fear, and a determination to protect the memory of her husband. But now, people wanted to celebrate her for it. "That's very kind of you," Arabella managed to say. I'll be there." As the days passed, Arabella found herself returning to the cemetery more often than before. Thomas's grave had always been a place of solace, a refuge where she could speak her heart without fear of judgment. But now, it was something more. A reminder of what she had fought to protect. One afternoon, she knelt by the gravestone, her hands busy clearing away leaves and debris. "Thomas," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "It's over. They're gone. The police caught them." She paused, her fingers brushing against the cool stone. "I hope I did right by you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I couldn't let them ruin this place. Not here. Not where you rest." The wind stirred gently, rustling the branches overhead. Arabella closed her eyes, letting the quiet surround her. She imagined Thomas's hand on her shoulder, his voice reassuring her the way he always had. "You did what you had to, Ali," she could almost hear him say. "And I'm proud of you for it." When the day of the ceremony arrived, Arabella stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the fabric of her dress. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple navy blue she'd chosen for its comfort. But as she adjusted the neckline and added a string of pearls Thomas had given her years ago, she felt a quiet strength settle over her. The ceremony was held in the town hall, a modest room filled with folding chairs and a podium draped in the American flag. Arabella sat near the front, flanked by Detective Harlan and Deputy Chief Morgan. She listened as they spoke about the investigation, highlighting the risks and the importance of community members like her stepping forward. When they called her name, the applause was warm and genuine, but Arabella's steps were tentative as she approached the podium. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she took a deep breath and steadied herself. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying over the quiet room. This is an honor I never expected. Truthfully, I'm still trying to make sense of everything that's happened." She paused, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I didn't do this to be brave. I did it because it was the right thing to do. My husband, Thomas, is buried in that cemetery, and it's a place I've always found peace. When I saw something that didn't belong there, I couldn't ignore it. I'd like to think he was watching over me through all of this, that he gave me the strength to act when I was scared out of my mind. She smiled faintly, her voice softening. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us protecting what matters most. And for me, that's the memory of someone I loved. The applause rose again as Arabella stepped away from the podium, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The path to the cemetery felt familiar yet different as Arabella walked it once more. Her steps were steady, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The chill in the air was the same as it always had been, but the weight on her chest was gone. For the first time in weeks, she felt a quiet sense of peace as she approached Thomas's grave. The officers had done their work well. The area near his resting place was untouched now, the soil smooth and undisturbed. Small signs of increased vigilance were scattered discreetly around. New cameras mounted on poles, a patrol car idling at the cemetery's entrance. It didn't feel invasive. Instead, it felt like a promise. Arabella knelt by the grave, brushing away a few stray leaves that had settled overnight. "Hi, Thomas," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of warmth that had been missing before. She placed fresh flowers at the base of the headstone, the vibrant blooms a contrast against the muted tones of the earth. As she adjusted them, her fingers lingered on the cool stone. "They've done a good job here," she continued, her voice steady. "I think you'd be proud. It's safe again. Nobody's going to use this place for something ugly, not anymore." She sat back on her heels, her gaze lifting to the tree line where she'd first seen the two men. The memory was still sharp, but it no longer held the same power over her. What once had been a source of fear now felt like a closed chapter. A scar, yes, but one that no longer bled. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," Arabella said, her words deliberate. "And you know, I keep coming back to the same thought. If it wasn't for you, I might not have noticed that hole. I might not have had the courage to do anything about it. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like you were guiding me, like you were watching out for me." Her voice wavered slightly, but she didn't shy away from the emotion. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt comforting rather than eerie. Arabella closed her eyes, letting the sounds of nature surround her, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of birds in the distance. For weeks she had carried the weight of what had happened, the fear, the danger, the uncertainty. But now, as she sat by Thomas's grave, all of it felt worth it. What she'd done hadn't just been for him. It had been for the community, for the people who would come to this place seeking the same peace she always had. It wasn't just about protecting his memory. It was about ensuring that no one else's memories would be tarnished. Arabella stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees. She took one last look at the headstone, a faint smile playing at her lips. "I'll be back soon," she promised. As she turned to leave, her steps felt lighter. The walk back to her car was unhurried, the weight that had followed her so persistently now nowhere to be found. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the cemetery in warm, golden light. Arabella paused near the gate, glancing back one last time. In the soft glow, the headstones looked less like markers of loss and more like symbols of love and remembrance. For the first time in weeks, Arabella felt something she hadn't dared to acknowledge before: hope. Driving home, she allowed herself to think about the future, something she'd avoided since Thomas's passing. There was no roadmap for what came next, no clear plan. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare her. She thought about the ceremony, The kind words people had spoken to her, the way the community had come together in support. It had reminded her that she wasn't alone, even when she felt like she was. Arabella tightened her grip on the wheel, her lips curving into a faint smile. She didn't need to have all the answers right now. For now, it was enough to know that she had made a difference, that she had faced her fears and come out stronger on the other side. Later that evening, Arabella sat by the fireplace, the warmth wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. The framed commendation still sat on the mantel, a quiet reminder of everything she had been through. In her hands, she held a small photo album, its leather cover worn from years of use. She flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers tracing the familiar faces captured within. There was Thomas, his smile as warm and steady as ever. There were pictures of their daughter as a child, of family gatherings, of holidays spent together. Each image was a memory, a piece of a life she was still learning to live without. But as Arabella turned the pages, she realized something. These memories weren't just relics of the past. They were a foundation, a reminder of what she had built and what she still carried with her. "I think I understand now," she said aloud, her voice soft but sure. "It's not about holding on to the way things were. It's about carrying them forward, about letting them guide me." She closed the album gently, setting it aside. The fire crackled softly, the sound filling the quiet room. Arabella leaned back, her eyes drifting shut. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so daunting. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew she had the strength to face it. And as she drifted into a peaceful sleep, she felt certain of one thing. Thomas was still with her, watching over her, just as he always had. The story of Arabella is a poignant journey of grief, resilience, and quiet heroism. At its core, it is not just a tale of uncovering a dark mystery, but a profound exploration of how loss can reshape us and inspire courage in the most unexpected ways. Arabella's determination to protect the sanctity of her husband's resting place serves as a powerful metaphor for honoring love and memory, even amidst chaos and danger. What stands out most is Arabella's transformation. Initially paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, she evolves into someone willing to confront threats far beyond her comfort zone. Her vulnerability makes her relatable, while her bravery turns her into an unlikely hero. The narrative reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it. The story's humanistic lesson lies in the value of community and standing up for what's right. Arabella's actions ripple outward, safeguarding not just her personal space, but also her broader community. It emphasizes the power of ordinary people to effect change when they follow their instincts and take a stand against wrongs. Ultimately, Arabella's journey teaches us that strength can be found in the deepest pain, and even the smallest actions can leave a lasting impact. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.